What happens when a single moment of prejudice costs an entire corporation everything it has built over decades? When flight attendant Rebecca Walsh looked to Dr. Camille Washington in seat 4A and decided she wasn't worthy of basic courtesy, she had no idea she was staring at the wife of one of the most powerful financial titans in America. What followed was not just revenge, but a complete dismantling and rebuilding of an entire aviation empire that would send shockwaves through corporate boardrooms worldwide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the bustling terminal of Chicago O'Hare International Airport as passengers hurried toward their gates, dragging wheeled suitcases and clutching coffee cups like lifelines. Gate B7 buzzed with the controlled chaos that preceded every transcontinental departure, but Atlantic Sky Airways Flight 448 to Los Angeles was no ordinary journey for the passengers settling in to the premium cabin. Dr. Camille Washington moved through the jet bridge with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to command respect through excellence rather than expectation. At 38, she carried herself with the poise that came from years of high-stakes decision-making, her deep brown skin glowing with the kind of health that spoke of someone who took care of herself despite crushing professional demands. Her hair was styled in an elegant twist, secured with a simple gold clip that matched the understated jewelry adorning her wrists and ears. She wore a charcoal gray blazer over dark jeans, the kind of effortless sophistication that spoke of both comfort and authority. Few people on the aircraft knew they were sharing space with one of the most respected cardiovascular surgeons in the Midwest. Dr. Washington had spent the previous week performing 3 complex heart surgeries, including a groundbreaking procedure on a 6-year-old boy with a congenital defect that other surgeons had deemed inoperable. Her steady hands had guided tiny instruments through chambers smaller than walnuts, repairing what nature had left incomplete. The surgery had been a success, but the emotional toll of holding a child's life in her hands never quite faded, even after 15 years of practice. This trip to Los Angeles wasn't for pleasure. Dr. Washington was scheduled to deliver the keynote address at the National Cardiovascular Surgery Conference, where she would present her latest research on minimally invasive pediatric procedures. The presentation represented 2 years of meticulous work, countless late nights analyzing data, and the hopes of families whose children might benefit from her innovations. She had chosen this particular flight because Atlantic Sky Airways had a reputation for excellent service, and she needed these few hours of peace to review her notes one final time. As she settled into seat 4A, Dr. Washington pulled out a leather portfolio containing her presentation materials. The cabin around her hummed with the quiet efficiency of premium service, all brushed aluminum fixtures and soft lighting designed to create an atmosphere of exclusivity. She had earned her place here through years of sacrifice, medical school debt that had taken a decade to repay, and the relentless pursuit of perfection that her profession demanded. Across the aisle in seat 4B sat her husband of 12 years, Marcus Washington. Where Camille's expertise was measured in lives saved and medical breakthroughs, Marcus operated in a world of numbers, market movements, and strategic acquisitions that most people never saw or understood. He appeared unremarkable in his simple navy polo shirt and khaki pants, reading what looked like a paperback thriller. His wedding ring was a plain gold band, and he wore no watch, no status symbols that might hint at his true influence. Marcus Washington was the founder and managing partner of Apex Capital Management, a private investment firm so successful and discreet that it managed portfolios worth over $40 billion. His clients included sovereign wealth funds, major university endowments, and ultra-high net worth families who valued his ability to generate consistent returns while avoiding the spotlight. Marcus had built his reputation on patience, meticulous research, and an almost supernatural ability to identify undervalued assets before the market caught on. He had grown up in Detroit, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher who had instilled in him the values of hard work and education. A full scholarship to Northwestern had opened doors he never could have imagined, leading to an MBA from Wharton and eventually to Wall Street. But unlike many of his peers who wore their wealth like armor, Marcus had never forgotten where he came from. His success was a tool, not an identity, and his greatest pride came not from his portfolio performance, but from watching Camille save lives. The couple had met during their residency years, when Marcus was completing his MBA while working at a hospital consulting firm. Camille had been a surgical resident working 18 hours a day, and their first conversation had taken place in a hospital cafeteria at 2 in the morning. She had been reviewing surgical videos on her laptop while grabbing a quick meal between procedures, and he had been struck not just by her beauty, but by the intensity of her focus, the way she studied each movement of the surgeon's hands as if she were memorizing a prayer. Their relationship had been built on mutual respect and shared ambition. Marcus understood the demands of Camille's career, the unpredictable hours, the emotional weight of her work, the way she would sometimes come home exhausted and need to decompress in silence before she could talk about her day. He had structured his own career to support hers, building Apex Capital with the flexibility to travel when needed and the financial security to give Camille complete freedom to pursue her research without worrying about their economic future. The previous month had been particularly brutal for Camille. She had lost a patient, a 7-year-old girl with the rare heart condition, despite everything she and her team had tried. The child's death had hit her harder than most, perhaps because the girl had reminded her of her own niece. Camille had spent days questioning every decision, reviewing every detail of the surgery, wondering if there was something different she could have done.
Marcus had watched his wife struggle with the grief and self-doubt that came with her profession. He had seen her wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for medical journals, replaying scenarios in her mind. When the invitation to speak at the Los Angeles conference had arrived, he had encouraged her to accept, knowing that sharing her research and connecting with colleagues might help her process the loss while also advancing the field she had dedicated her life to. The flight represented more than just transportation for both of them. For Camille, it was a chance to step away from the hospital environment and focus on the broader impact of her work. For Marcus, it was an opportunity to spend uninterrupted time with his wife, something that had become increasingly rare as both their careers had reached new heights of success and responsibility. As passengers continued boarding around them, neither Marcus nor Camille noticed the flight attendant making her way through the premium cabin, checking seat assignments and mentally cataloging the passengers according to her own internal hierarchy. Rebecca Walsh had been working for Atlantic Sky Airways for 8 years, and she prided herself on her ability to read people, to determine within seconds who deserved her best attention and who could be managed with minimal effort. Rebecca came from a small town in Ohio where she had been considered sophisticated for traveling to Columbus on weekends. The flight attendant position had seemed glamorous when she started, offering the chance to see different cities and interact with successful people. Over the years, however, the job had become routine, and she had developed a cynical view of passengers, sorting them into categories based on their appearance, behavior, and her assumptions about their background and status. She had learned to perform enthusiasm for passengers she deemed important while maintaining a professional but distant demeanor with those she considered ordinary. The skill had served her well in terms of tips and positive reviews from the passengers who mattered to management, but it had also fed a growing sense of superiority that she wore like an invisible uniform. As Rebecca approached row 4, she had already made her assessment. The man in 4B looked unremarkable, possibly a mid-level manager or small business owner who had lucked into an upgrade. The woman in 4A was harder to categorize, but Rebecca's first impression was skeptical. Despite the expensive-looking blazer and obvious education suggested by the medical journals visible in her bag, something about the situation didn't align with Rebecca's expectations of who belonged in premium seating. The afternoon light streaming through the aircraft windows created patterns on the cabin floor as the final passengers found their seats. Dr. Camille Washington adjusted her reading glasses and opened her portfolio. unaware that the next few hours would transform not just her own life, but the entire trajectory of the airline industry. Marcus continued reading his book, occasionally glancing at his wife with the quiet contentment of someone who had found his perfect companion. Neither of them could have imagined that within minutes, a simple request for a beverage would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape corporate America's understanding of respect, dignity, and the true cost of prejudice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would prove that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice comes not from anger or protest, but from the quiet, methodical application of resources and influence that most people never see coming. The aircraft doors sealed shut, and Flight 448 prepared for departure, carrying its passengers toward a destination none of them could have anticipated. Atlantic Sky Airways Flight 448 climbed steadily through the afternoon sky, leaving behind the sprawling landscape of Illinois as it headed west toward California. The aircraft had reached its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, and the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of a long-distance flight. Passengers opened laptops, adjusted reading lights, and prepared to spend the next 4 hours in their aluminum cocoon above the clouds. Rebecca Walsh began her beverage service with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this routine thousands of times. She moved through the premium cabin with her cart. The soft clink of glassware accompanied her progress down the aisle. Her approach to service was methodical and revealing, a carefully orchestrated performance that demonstrated her ability to read and categorize passengers within seconds of interaction. Her first stop was row 2, where Jonathan Phillips sat reviewing quarterly reports on his tablet. Phillips was a regular on this route, a pharmaceutical executive who flew between Chicago and Los Angeles twice monthly for board meetings. Rebecca recognized him immediately and brightened with genuine enthusiasm. "Mr. Phillips, welcome back aboard Atlantic Sky. The usual Macallan whiskey to start your afternoon?" "Rebecca, you have an incredible memory. Make it a double today, would you? Board meeting tomorrow morning." "Of course, sir. I'll make sure you have everything you need for a productive flight." She poured the premium scotch with practiced flair, ensuring the crystal tumbler was positioned perfectly on his tray table, along with a small dish of mixed nuts and a cloth napkin. Her movements were graceful, almost theatrical, designed to make Phillips feel valued and important. The interaction lasted for several minutes as she inquired about his family and made small talk about his business travels. 2 rows behind Phillips sat Maria Gonzalez, a software engineer heading to Los Angeles for a tech conference. Maria had saved for months to afford the premium seat upgrade, viewing it as a rare treat after landing a promotion at her startup company. She wore a simple black sweater and jeans, her laptop bag tucked neatly under the seat in front of her.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. When Rebecca approached Maria's row, the transformation in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The warm smile became more restrained, professional but distant. Her movements lost their theatrical quality, becoming efficient rather than graceful. "What can I get you to drink today?" "I'd love a glass of Chardonnay, please. I'm celebrating a work promotion." Rebecca nodded without enthusiasm, pouring the wine quickly and placing it on Maria's tray table without ceremony. She didn't ask follow-up questions about the promotion or engage in the kind of personal conversation she had shared with Phillips. The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds before she moved on to the next passenger. In row 3 sat retired Judge Harold Morrison, a distinguished elderly man with silver hair and an expensive suit who commanded immediate respect from Rebecca. She spent considerable time discussing his recent vacation to Scotland, refilling his coffee cup twice, and ensuring he had extra cream and sugar. Morrison basked in the attention, sharing stories about his judicial career and offering opinions on current legal matters that Rebecca listened to with apparent fascination. By the time Rebecca reached row 4, she had established a clear pattern of service that reflected her internal hierarchy of passenger importance. She had unconsciously sorted her customers into categories based on appearance, perceived status, and her own assumptions about who deserved premium treatment versus basic courtesy. Dr. Camille Washington had been observing these interactions with the trained eye of someone who had spent years navigating professional environments where respect was often conditional. She had watched Rebecca's animated conversation with Phillips, noted the perfunctory service provided to Maria, and witnessed the deferential treatment given to Judge Morrison. The pattern was familiar and disappointing, but not entirely surprising. When Rebecca finally arrived at their row, she first addressed Marcus, who looked up from his paperback novel with polite attention. Despite his casual appearance, something about his calm demeanor and direct gaze gave Rebecca pause, though she couldn't quite identify what made her slightly uncertain. "Good afternoon, sir. What would you like to drink today?" "I'll have a coffee. Black. Thank you." Rebecca poured the coffee efficiently, her manner professional but unremarkable. Marcus accepted the beverage with a quiet thank you and returned to his book, giving no indication of displeasure or particular interest in the service. Then Rebecca turned to Dr. Washington, and the shift in her demeanor was immediate and stark. Where she had shown enthusiasm with Phillips and deference with Morrison, her expression now became guarded and skeptical. Her eyes took in Camille's appearance, the medical journals, the expensive blazer, and something about the combination triggered her suspicion rather than respect. "And what would you like?" The question was delivered in a tone that suggested Rebecca was already impatient, as if she expected this passenger to be difficult or demanding. Dr. Washington, who had been hoping for a peaceful moment to review her conference notes, looked up with a gentle smile. "I'd like a glass of champagne, please." Rebecca's response was swift and decisive, delivered with barely concealed irritation. "The champagne service is reserved for our Platinum Elite members on transcontinental flights. It's a new policy to ensure our most valued customers receive priority treatment. I can offer you wine or other beverages from our standard selection." The lie was so blatant and poorly constructed that it took Camille's breath away for a moment. She had literally watched Rebecca serve champagne to 3 other passengers in the past 20 minutes, including Maria Gonzalez, who had clearly ordered wine specifically because she wanted to celebrate her promotion. Phillips had been offered premium liquor without even requesting it, and Judge Morrison had received champagne with his meal service. Dr. Washington felt the familiar sting of discrimination, the particular pain that came from being judged unworthy based solely on the color of her skin. The feeling was not new, but its persistence, after all her achievements, after all the lives she had saved and the respect she had earned in her field, never failed to surprise her with its sharpness. For a moment, she considered several responses. She could produce her medical credentials, explain that she was a keynote speaker at a major conference, mention that she had paid the same fare as every other passenger in premium seating. She could demand to speak with a supervisor or threaten to file a complaint with the airline. She could match Rebecca's rudeness with justified anger. Instead, Dr. Washington drew on the reservoir of grace she had developed over years of facing similar situations. Her voice remained calm and controlled, betraying none of the hurt or frustration she felt. "I see. In that case, I'll have a glass of white wine, please." Rebecca's satisfaction was visible, a brief flicker of triumph in her eyes as she poured the wine. She had successfully put this passenger in what she perceived to be her proper place, reinforcing the hierarchy she believed should govern interactions in premium seating. The wine was served quickly and without ceremony, the glass placed on Camille's tray table with barely disguised dismissiveness. As Rebecca moved away to continue her service, she felt vindicated in her assessment. The passenger had accepted the refusal without argument, confirming Rebecca's belief that she lacked the status or authority to challenge the decision. What Rebecca failed to recognize was that Camille's composed response was not submission, but strategy, the reaction of someone who had learned to choose her battles carefully and fight them on her own terms. Marcus had observed the entire exchange with growing anger that he kept carefully hidden behind his calm exterior. He had watched his wife face countless instances of discrimination over the years, but witnessing it happen in real time never failed to ignite a cold fury in him. He saw the hurt that Camille tried to hide, recognized the practiced way she deflected the pain and maintained her dignity. He also noticed details that Rebecca had missed in her prejudiced assessment. He saw Professor David Chen in row 5, an elderly Asian academic who had been served champagne without question, despite his modest appearance. He observed that Maria Gonzalez had been offered champagne as an alternative to wine, but had chosen wine for personal preference. He noted that every white passenger in premium seating had been offered champagne as a standard option, while his accomplished wife had been told it was restricted to elite members. The pattern was unmistakable, and Marcus began to formulate a response that would be both appropriate and effective. Unlike Camille, who had to consider the impact of confrontation on her professional reputation and future interactions, Marcus operated in a world where respect was commanded through demonstrated power rather than requested through appeals to fairness. As the flight continued, Rebecca's differential treatment became even more pronounced. When meal service began, she presented menu options to other passengers with detailed descriptions and recommendations, taking time to explain preparation methods and ingredients. When she reached Dr. Washington, she simply recited the choices in a monotone voice, as if reading from a grocery list. The salmon is prepared with a lemon herb sauce, and the chicken breast is served with roasted vegetables. What would you prefer? Camille chose the salmon, and Rebecca disappeared into the galley to prepare the meals. When she returned 20 minutes later, she served the other passengers first, taking time to ensure their meals were properly arranged and garnished. Judge Morrison received his with a flourish, complete with freshly ground pepper and a warm bread roll. When Rebecca finally reached Dr. Washington, she placed the meal on the tray table without comment. The salmon was noticeably smaller than the portions served to other passengers, and the vegetables appeared to be the last remnants from the serving tray, slightly overcooked and less attractively arranged. The systematic nature of the poor service was becoming impossible to ignore. Marcus watched as his wife graciously accepted substandard treatment while maintaining her composure, and he began to consider options that went far beyond filing a complaint or demanding better service. His mind started to work in the analytical mode that had made him successful in high-stakes financial negotiations, identifying leverage points and potential responses that Rebecca Walsh could never have imagined. Dr. Washington continued to handle each slight with remarkable grace, but Marcus could see the toll it was taking. This was supposed to be a peaceful flight where she could prepare for her important presentation, not an endurance test of her ability to maintain dignity in the face of systematic disrespect. As Rebecca continued her service to other rows, she remained oblivious to the storm she had unleashed. She had no idea that the woman she had dismissed as unworthy of basic courtesy was one of the most respected surgeons in the Midwest, or that the quiet man reading beside her controlled investment portfolios worth billions of dollars. The aircraft continued its westward journey through the afternoon sky, carrying its passengers toward Los Angeles while the seeds of corporate revolution grew in the fertile ground of injustice and underestimated power. The remainder of Flight 448 passed in deceptive tranquility for most passengers, but beneath the surface calm, Marcus Washington's mind operated with the precision of a master chess player contemplating his next 20 moves. While other travelers dozed or entertained themselves with movies, Marcus had shifted into a strategic mode that few people ever witnessed, even among his closest business associates. He pulled out his smartphone, a device that appeared ordinary but was equipped with military-grade encryption and direct access to communication networks that existed far beyond the reach of commercial aviation Wi-Fi. The phone connected seamlessly to a satellite system that Apex Capital maintained for precisely these kinds of situations, when immediate, secure communication was essential. His first message went to Jennifer Kim, his chief research analyst based in Los Angeles. Jennifer was a former Department of Justice investigator who had joined Apex Capital 3 years earlier, bringing with her an unparalleled ability to uncover corporate vulnerabilities and map organizational structures with forensic precision. Jennifer, I need a complete corporate analysis on Atlantic Sky Airways and all parent companies. Full ownership structure, major shareholders, board composition, debt ratios, recent performance metrics, and leadership profiles. Also, pull all available data on company culture, HR practices,
employee satisfaction surveys, and any pending litigation. Priority Alpha. Need preliminary report within 2 hours. The response came back within minutes. Marcus, understood. Initiating comprehensive workup now. We'll have initial findings ready by landing time. Any specific areas of focus? Marcus considered his response carefully. Focus on financial vulnerabilities, ownership concentration, and any patterns of discrimination complaints or settlements. Also map all institutional investors and their liquidity positions. He then composed a second message to David Chen, his head of corporate strategy in Chicago. David was a former McKinsey partner who specialized in hostile acquisitions and had orchestrated some of the most complex corporate takeovers of the past decade. David, prepare acquisition scenarios for a mid-cap airline company. Assume target is publicly traded, revenue approximately $8 to $12 billion annually, moderate debt load. I want 3 approach strategies: friendly takeover, hostile acquisition, and strategic partnership with controlling interest. Timeline is accelerated. The third message went to Sarah Lopez, Apex Capital's legal counsel and a former federal prosecutor who understood both the letter and spirit of corporate law. Sarah had built a reputation for finding legal pathways that other lawyers never considered, always operating within ethical boundaries while maximizing strategic advantage. Sarah, research employment law cases involving airline industry discrimination. Focus on successful settlements, class action precedents, and regulatory oversight mechanisms. Also review corporate governance requirements for publicly traded airlines and any recent changes to federal aviation oversight. As these initial communications established the foundation for his investigation, Marcus began his own preliminary research using resources available through his encrypted device. He accessed Apex Capital's proprietary database of corporate intelligence, a system that aggregated public records, financial filings, news reports, and analytical data from dozens of sources into comprehensive company profiles. Atlantic Sky Airways emerged from his research as a company that had grown rapidly through acquisitions over the past 15 years, but had struggled to integrate its various subsidiaries into a cohesive corporate culture. The airline was publicly traded on the NASDAQ under the symbol ASKY, with a market capitalization of approximately $6 billion. The company had been profitable for 7 consecutive years, but showed signs of stagnation in customer satisfaction metrics and employee retention rates. The ownership structure revealed several interesting vulnerabilities. Approximately 38% of shares were held by institutional investors, including pension funds and mutual fund companies. Another 22% was controlled by the founding family, the Brennan Group, which had started the airline in 1987. The remaining 40% was distributed among smaller institutional investors and individual shareholders. Marcus noted that 2 of the largest institutional shareholders, Meridian Asset Management and Pacific Investment Group, had both been struggling with liquidity issues due to poor performance in their real estate investment portfolios. These firms might be motivated to sell their Atlantic Sky holdings quickly if presented with an attractive offer that provided immediate cash injection. The leadership structure showed classic signs of an insular corporate culture. CEO Michael Brennan was the founder's son, and the board of directors included several family friends and long-term company veterans. The executive team had limited diversity, and the company had been criticized in industry publications for its slow adaptation to changing customer expectations and regulatory requirements. Marcus discovered that Atlantic Sky Airways had faced several discrimination lawsuits over the past 5 years, most of which had been settled out of court with confidentiality agreements. The pattern suggested systemic issues rather than isolated incidents, indicating that Rebecca Walsh's behavior was likely symptomatic of broader cultural problems within the organization. His research also revealed that the airline industry was facing increasing pressure from both regulatory agencies and activist investors to improve diversity and inclusion practices. Several competitors had recently announced major initiatives to address workplace discrimination and improve customer service standards, creating competitive pressure on Atlantic Sky to follow suit or risk losing market share. As Marcus compiled this initial intelligence, his phone began receiving responses from his team. Jennifer Kim's preliminary report arrived first, delivered as an encrypted document that painted a detailed picture of Atlantic Sky's corporate anatomy. Jennifer had identified several critical vulnerabilities. The company's debt-to-equity ratio was higher than industry averages, making it susceptible to financial pressure. Customer satisfaction ratings had declined steadily over the past 2 years, particularly in the premium service categories that generated the highest profit margins. Employee turnover in customer-facing positions was significantly above industry norms, suggesting internal culture problems that affected service quality. Most importantly, Jennifer had discovered that Atlantic Sky was in the middle of negotiating a major route expansion deal with the European Union that required demonstrating compliance with strict anti-discrimination policies. Any PR crisis related to discriminatory practices could jeopardize the expansion and cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars in potential revenue. David Chen's strategic analysis provided the tactical framework for potential acquisition approaches. He had identified that a hostile takeover could be accomplished through a combination of open market purchases and targeted acquisition of shares from the struggling institutional investors. The key would be speed and stealth, accumulating a controlling position before management could mount an effective defense. David's analysis suggested that Apex Capital could acquire a controlling interest for approximately $4 billion, assuming they were willing to pay a premium above current market prices. The acquisition could be structured to appear as a financial investment rather than a strategic takeover, at least initially, allowing Marcus to gain control before revealing his intentions.
Sarah Lopez's legal research revealed several important precedents that could be leveraged in any confrontation with Atlantic Sky management. Recent court decisions had established clear standards for corporate responsibility in addressing discriminatory practices, and regulatory agencies were increasingly willing to impose substantial penalties on companies that failed to maintain appropriate oversight of employee behavior. More significantly, Sarah had identified that Atlantic Sky's current employment contracts included broad moral turpitude clauses that could be used to terminate employees who engaged in discriminatory behavior without the typical severance protections. This meant that Rebecca Walsh and any supervisors who had enabled her behavior could be removed immediately once Marcus gained control of the company. As Flight 448 began its descent toward Los Angeles, Marcus had assembled a comprehensive battle plan that addressed every aspect of the challenge ahead. He understood Atlantic Sky's financial position, its leadership structure, its operational vulnerabilities, and its legal exposure. More importantly, he had identified the specific pressure points that would allow him to gain control quickly and implement the changes necessary to ensure that no other passenger would experience what Camille had endured. The irony was not lost on him that Rebecca Walsh had unknowingly provided him with the perfect justification for an acquisition he might have pursued anyway. Atlantic Sky Airways was exactly the kind of undervalued, poorly managed company that Apex Capital specialized in acquiring and transforming. The discrimination incident had simply provided both the moral imperative and the strategic opportunity to act decisively. Marcus looked over at Camille, who had managed to fall asleep despite the earlier unpleasantness. Her face was peaceful in rest, and he felt a surge of protective love that reinforced his determination to pursue this course of action. She had spent her career saving lives and advancing medical knowledge, and she deserved to travel through the world without facing the casual cruelty of people like Rebecca Walsh. As the aircraft's wheels touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, Marcus Washington had already set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just Atlantic Sky Airways, but the entire airline industry's approach to customer service and corporate accountability. Rebecca Walsh, finishing her post-flight duties and looking forward to her layover in Los Angeles, remained completely unaware that she had just created the conditions for her own professional destruction and the complete restructuring of the company she worked for. The plane taxied toward the gate as the California sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, and Marcus prepared to implement a plan that would prove that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is not confrontation, but complete and systematic transformation of the systems that enable discrimination to flourish. The Beverly Hills hotel suite that Marcus and Camille Washington had reserved for their Los Angeles stay became the unlikely command center for one of the most audacious corporate acquisitions in modern aviation history.
While Camille prepared for her keynote presentation at the cardiovascular conference, Marcus transformed the elegant sitting room into a war room equipped with multiple secured communication lines, encrypted laptops, and direct connections to financial markets across 3 continents. By 6 o'clock Pacific time, less than 2 hours after their flight had landed, Marcus had assembled his complete acquisition team via secure video conference. The faces on his screen represented some of the most formidable financial minds in the industry, each bringing specialized expertise to what would become known in business schools as the Los Angeles lightning strike. Jennifer Kim appeared on screen from her downtown Los Angeles office, surrounded by monitors displaying real-time financial data, corporate filings, and analytical reports. Her preliminary research had evolved into a comprehensive corporate anatomy that revealed Atlantic Sky Airways' vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Marcus, we've completed the deep dive on Atlantic Sky. The situation is even better than we initially anticipated. The company is more fragile than their public statements suggest. Jennifer's analysis had uncovered critical weaknesses that made Atlantic Sky Airways an ideal acquisition target. The airline's recent expansion into international routes had stretched their cash reserves, leaving them dependent on quarterly revenue targets to maintain their debt service obligations. More importantly, their customer satisfaction scores had been declining steadily, particularly in the premium service categories that generated their highest profit margins. The timing is perfect, Jennifer continued. 2 of their largest institutional shareholders, Meridian Asset Management and Pacific Investment Group, are both facing significant liquidity pressures from their real estate portfolios. Our intelligence suggests they need to liquidate approximately $2 billion in assets within the next 60 days to meet their obligations. David Chen joined the conversation from Chicago, where he had been modeling acquisition scenarios throughout the afternoon. His strategic analysis provided the tactical framework for a hostile takeover that could be executed with unprecedented speed and stealth. We can structure this as a 3-phase operation. Phase 1 involves immediate open market purchases to establish a foothold without triggering disclosure requirements. Phase 2 targets the distressed institutional investors with premium cash offers they cannot refuse. Phase 3 involves strategic acquisitions from smaller shareholders to cross the control threshold. David's plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. By keeping individual purchases below the 5% threshold that required public disclosure, Apex Capital could accumulate a substantial position before Atlantic Sky Management realized they were under attack. The distressed institutional investors would be approached with offers significantly above current market prices, but with 24-hour expiration deadlines that prevented them from seeking competing bids. Sarah Lopez provided the legal framework that would protect the acquisition from regulatory challenges and ensure compliance with federal aviation oversight requirements. Her research had identified precedents that would allow Apex Capital to gain control of Atlantic Sky while maintaining the airline's operating certificates and route authorities. The Federal Aviation Administration has established clear guidelines for airline ownership transitions. As long as we maintain operational continuity and demonstrate financial stability, regulatory approval should be straightforward. The discrimination issues actually work in our favor because they establish justification for management changes. Sarah had also prepared comprehensive employment law strategies that would allow immediate termination of problematic employees while protecting the acquisition from wrongful dismissal claims. The moral turpitude clauses in Atlantic Sky's employment contracts provided broad authority to remove personnel who had engaged in discriminatory behavior. Marcus listened to each presentation with the focused intensity that had made him legendary among institutional investors. His questions were precise and probing, designed to identify any potential weaknesses in their strategy or unexpected obstacles that could derail the acquisition. What's the maximum price we might need to pay to guarantee success? Jennifer immediately responded. Based on current market conditions and the liquidity pressures facing the major shareholders, we estimate we can acquire controlling interest at approximately $4.2 billion.
That represents a 28% premium over current market prices, but it ensures rapid execution and minimizes the risk of competing bids. Timeline for complete execution? David Chen had anticipated this question. We can complete Phase 1 within 12 hours using our existing market positions and trading relationships. Phase 2 requires direct negotiation with the institutional investors, which we estimate will take 24 to 36 hours. Phase 3 depends on market conditions, but should be completed within 72 hours of initiation.
The speed of the proposed timeline was breathtaking. Most hostile takeovers required weeks or months to execute, giving target companies time to mount defenses and seek alternative arrangements. Marcus's plan would give Atlantic Sky Management no opportunity to respond effectively before control of their company had shifted completely. Execute Phase 1 immediately. Jennifer, initiate open market purchases across all our trading platforms. Keep individual transactions small and use different brokers to avoid pattern recognition. David, begin contacting the institutional investors. Offer them 25% above current market price with 24-hour decision deadlines. Sarah, prepare all necessary regulatory filings, but do not submit them until we cross the control threshold. As his team began implementing the acquisition strategy, Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with high-stakes financial warfare. This was not merely about revenge or personal satisfaction, it was about demonstrating that systematic discrimination carried real consequences and that corporate culture could be transformed through decisive action. The first phase began executing within 30 minutes of the conference call's conclusion. Across trading floors in New York, London, Hong Kong, and Los Angeles, Apex Capital's representatives began purchasing Atlantic Sky Airways stock through a carefully orchestrated series of transactions. Each purchase was small enough to avoid triggering automated surveillance systems, but collectively, they represented a substantial accumulation of shares. Marcus monitored the progress through real-time trading screens that displayed every transaction as it occurred. The stock price began rising gradually as the increased demand created upward pressure, but the movements appeared random rather than systematic, giving no indication that a coordinated acquisition was underway. Simultaneously, David Chen initiated contact with the distressed institutional investors. His approach was direct and compelling. Apex Capital was prepared to offer immediate cash payment for their Atlantic Sky holdings at prices significantly above current market values, but the offers would expire within 24 hours and could not be extended or renegotiated. Meridian Asset Management was the first to respond. Their portfolio manager, facing pressure from clients concerned about their real estate losses, agreed to sell their 8% stake in Atlantic Sky for $380 million, nearly $100 million more than the shares were worth at current market prices. The transaction would be completed through electronic transfer within 6 hours of agreement. Pacific Investment Group proved more cautious initially, but their liquidity pressures ultimately overcame their hesitation. They agreed to sell their 12% stake for $580 million, providing them with immediate cash to address their real estate portfolio problems. The combined transactions gave Apex Capital control of 20% of Atlantic Sky Airways within 18 hours of Marcus's decision to proceed. While the financial acquisition unfolded, Jennifer Kim's team conducted a deeper investigation into Atlantic Sky's internal operations. They accessed employee satisfaction surveys, customer complaint databases, and internal communications that revealed the systematic nature of the discrimination problems. Rebecca Walsh was not an isolated case, but part of a broader pattern of prejudiced behavior that had been ignored or actively covered up by management. The research team discovered that Atlantic Sky had received over 200 formal discrimination complaints in the past 3 years, most of which had been dismissed without investigation or settled with minimal financial penalties. The pattern suggested that discriminatory behavior was not just tolerated, but implicitly encouraged by management's failure to address it effectively. By the morning of the second day, Apex Capital controlled 38% of Atlantic Sky Airways and was rapidly approaching the threshold that would trigger mandatory disclosure requirements. Marcus authorized David Chen to accelerate Phase 3, targeting smaller institutional investors and individual shareholders with premium offers designed to push their ownership above 50%. The speed and stealth of the acquisition had been so effective that Atlantic Sky management remained completely unaware of what was happening to their company. CEO Michael Brennan was attending a conference in Miami, focused on the airline's European expansion plans and unaware that control of his company was slipping away with each passing hour. The breakthrough came at 2:47 p.m. Pacific Time on the second day when Apex Capital's ownership crossed the 51% threshold. Marcus Washington now controlled Atlantic Sky Airways, giving him the authority to replace management, restructure operations, and implement whatever changes he deemed necessary to address the cultural problems that had allowed Rebecca Walsh to discriminate against his wife. The mandatory disclosure filing was submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission at exactly 3 p.m., officially announcing that HSG Investments, a subsidiary of Apex Capital Management, had acquired a controlling interest in Atlantic Sky Airways. The filing triggered immediate alert systems throughout the financial industry, and within minutes, news of the hostile takeover was spreading across trading floors and financial news networks. Michael Brennan received the news while delivering a presentation about Atlantic Sky's growth strategy to potential European partners. His assistant interrupted the meeting to inform him that his company had been acquired by an unknown investment firm in what appeared to be the fastest hostile takeover in aviation industry history. The shock was immediate and devastating. Brennan had built his career around Atlantic Sky Airways, taking over from his father and expanding the company into a major regional carrier. The idea that control of his life's work could be stripped away in less than 48 hours by investors he had never heard of was both incomprehensible and terrifying. Emergency meetings were called, lawyers were consulted, and investment bankers were contacted, but the acquisition had been executed so precisely that no effective response was possible. Apex Capital's legal structure was impeccable, their financing was secure, and their ownership position was unassailable. As news of the takeover spread throughout the aviation industry, speculation ran rampant about the motivations behind such an aggressive acquisition. Atlantic Sky Airways was profitable but not extraordinary, making it an unusual target for such decisive action. Financial analysts struggled to identify the strategic logic behind a takeover that had been executed with such speed and determination. Marcus Washington, monitoring the reaction from his Beverly Hills command center, felt a profound satisfaction as the first phase of his response to Rebecca Walsh's discrimination was successfully completed. He now owned the airline that had allowed his wife to be treated with such disrespect, and he intended to use that ownership to ensure that no other passenger would face similar treatment. The corporate earthquake that Rebecca Walsh unknowingly triggered with her refusal to serve champagne to Dr. Camille Washington was just beginning, and its aftershocks would reshape not only Atlantic Sky Airways, but the entire airline industry's approach to customer service and corporate accountability. The emergency board meeting of Atlantic Sky Airways convened at 8 a.m. Eastern Time in the company's corporate headquarters in Atlanta, a gleaming tower that had symbolized the airline's success for over 2 decades. The mahogany-paneled boardroom, which had witnessed countless strategic decisions and celebratory announcements, now hosted what would become one of the most dramatic corporate confrontations in aviation industry history. Michael Brennan sat at the head of the polished conference table, his usually confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. Around him, the remaining board members, a collection of longtime company veterans, family friends, and industry insiders, struggled to comprehend how their company had been stripped away from them with such surgical precision. The overnight flight from Miami had given Brennan time to piece together fragments of information about the acquisition, but critical details remained maddeningly elusive. HSG Investments appeared to be a legitimate subsidiary of Apex Capital Management, but beyond basic corporate filings, the acquiring entity remained shrouded in mystery. Board member Patricia Reynolds, a former airline industry executive who had served on Atlantic Sky's board for 8 years, voiced the question that haunted everyone in the room. How does a company acquire controlling interest in a publicly traded airline without anyone noticing until it's too late? This level of coordination suggests resources and expertise that go far beyond typical financial investors. Chief Financial Officer Robert Martinez had spent the night reviewing transaction records and ownership transfers, trying to understand the mechanics of what had been done to their company. The acquisition was masterful in its execution. They used over 30 different brokers, kept individual purchases below disclosure thresholds, and targeted our most vulnerable shareholders with offers they couldn't refuse. Whoever orchestrated this understands corporate warfare at a level we've never encountered. The boardroom doors opened at precisely 8:30 a.m., and Marcus Washington entered with the quiet confidence of someone who had already won a war that his opponents were just beginning to understand. Behind him walked Dr. Camille Washington, her presence adding an unexpected dimension to what the board had anticipated would be a purely financial confrontation. Marcus wore a charcoal suit that spoke of understated elegance rather than flashy wealth, while Camille had chosen a navy dress that projected professional authority. Together, they represented a formidable combination of financial power and moral purpose that immediately shifted the dynamics in the room. Michael Brennan stood unsteadily, his voice betraying the strain of the past 18 hours. "I assume you represent the investors who have acquired our company. We demand to know the terms of this acquisition and your intentions for Atlantic Sky Airways." Marcus moved to the opposite end of the conference table, positioning himself directly across from Brennan in a symbolic assertion of the power transfer that had already occurred. He spoke with calm authority that filled the room. "I am Marcus Washington, managing partner of Apex Capital Management. This is my wife, Dr. Camille Washington. As of yesterday afternoon, our firm controls 51% of Atlantic Sky Airways, making us the majority shareholders of this company." The simplicity of his introduction belied the complexity of what he had accomplished. Board members exchanged uncertain glances, clearly struggling to reconcile the understated couple before them with the financial juggernaut that had dismantled their corporate defenses. Brennan attempted to reassert control of the situation. "Mr. Washington, while we acknowledge your acquisition, this board has fiduciary responsibilities to all shareholders. We need to understand your business plan and ensure continuity of operations." Marcus allowed a slight smile to cross his features. "Mr. Brennan, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of this meeting. This is not a negotiation or a discussion about continuity. This is a notification of changes that have already been decided." He gestured to Sarah Lopez, who had entered behind them carrying a leather portfolio containing legal documents that would formalize the corporate transformation. Sarah had flown overnight from Chicago to ensure that every aspect of the transition would be legally bulletproof and immediately enforceable. "My first action as majority shareholder is to request your immediate resignation as Chief Executive Officer, along with the resignations of Chief Operating Officer David Park and Vice President of Customer Service Linda Thompson. Your departures are effective immediately." The shock in the room was palpable. Patricia Reynolds found her voice first, her tone sharp with indignation. "This is completely inappropriate. You cannot simply walk into a boardroom and demand executive resignations without cause or proper procedures." Dr. Camille Washington spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "There is a cause, Miss Reynolds. Systematic discrimination that has been enabled by executive leadership and ignored by board oversight." She described the incident on Flight 448 with clinical precision, detailing every aspect of Rebecca Walsh's discriminatory behavior and the pattern of poor service that had characterized her treatment. Her account was delivered without emotion, but with devastating effectiveness. Each detail building a case that left no room for denial or deflection. This was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of corporate culture that your leadership has created and maintained. Flight attendant Rebecca Walsh felt empowered to deny service to a black passenger because your company's practices have consistently enabled such behavior. Board member James Harrison attempted to minimize the significance of the incident. "Dr. Washington, while we certainly don't condone discriminatory behavior,
A single employee's poor judgment hardly justifies this kind of drastic corporate action. Marcus responded with information that his research team had compiled overnight. Mr. Harrison, our investigation has identified over 200 formal discrimination complaints filed against Atlantic Sky Airways in the past 3 years. Most were dismissed without investigation or settled with confidentiality agreements that prevented public awareness of the pattern. Sarah Lopez opened her portfolio and distributed copies of a comprehensive report that documented the airline's history of discrimination complaints, settlement payments, and failed diversity initiatives. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented, leaving no avenue for the board to claim ignorance or dispute the systematic nature of the problems. Your company has paid over $12 million in discrimination settlements while publicly claiming commitment to diversity and inclusion. This represents a deliberate pattern of enabling discriminatory behavior while avoiding accountability through financial settlements. CFO Martinez reviewed the documents with growing alarm. The financial implications alone were staggering, but the potential regulatory consequences could be far worse. The Federal Aviation Administration had recently increased scrutiny of airline employment practices, and documented patterns of discrimination could jeopardize Atlantic's operating certificates. Dr. Washington continued her presentation, her medical background evident in the systematic way she diagnosed the corporate pathology. A company's culture is like a patient's health. Surface symptoms may seem manageable, but they often indicate deeper systemic problems that require comprehensive treatment rather than cosmetic fixes. She outlined the transformation that would begin immediately under new leadership. The first priority would be comprehensive cultural assessment conducted by independent investigators with full access to employee records, customer complaints, and internal communications. Every aspect of the company's operations would be examined to identify and eliminate discriminatory practices. The second phase would involve complete restructuring of human resources policies, mandatory bias training for all employees, and implementation of accountability measures that would ensure cultural changes became permanent rather than temporary responses to crisis. Marcus announced that Dr. Washington would serve as interim chief executive officer while a permanent replacement was identified and hired. The decision was both practical and symbolic, placing the victim of the airline's discriminatory culture in position to transform it completely. The board members sat in stunned silence as the scope of the changes became clear. This was not a typical corporate acquisition focused on financial returns, but a moral reckoning that would reshape every aspect of Atlantic Sky's operations. Brennan made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. "Mr. Washington, surely we can reach some accommodation that protects shareholder value while addressing your concerns about company culture." Marcus's response was final and uncompromising. "Mr. Brennan, shareholder value has already been protected through our acquisition. Company culture will be addressed through complete transformation under new leadership. Your role in that process ended when you failed to address systematic discrimination within your organization." Security personnel entered the boardroom to escort the terminated executives from the building, a humiliating end to careers that had been built on the foundation of Atlantic Sky Airways. The speed and decisiveness of their removal sent a clear message throughout the company that the era of tolerance for discriminatory behavior had ended permanently. As the former executives gathered their personal belongings under security supervision, Dr. Washington addressed the remaining board members who would continue to serve during the transition period. "We are not here to destroy this company, but to rebuild it into an organization that truly serves all customers with dignity and respect." The transformation of Atlantic Sky Airways had begun with surgical precision and moral clarity that left no doubt about the new direction. What had started as a simple request for champagne had evolved into a complete corporate revolution that would establish new standards for accountability and respect throughout the aviation industry.
Rebecca Walsh, finishing her shift at Los Angeles International Airport and preparing for her scheduled return flight to Chicago, remained completely unaware that the company she worked for had been acquired and that her employment would be terminated before her aircraft reached cruising altitude. The reckoning she had triggered through her prejudiced behavior was about to catch up with her. At 37,000 feet, in front of the very passengers she had learned to categorize and dismiss. The corporate earthquake that began with her refusal to serve champagne to Dr. Camille Washington was entering its most dramatic phase, and the aftershocks would reshape not only Atlantic Sky Airways but the entire airline industry's understanding of the true cost of discrimination. The news of Atlantic Sky Airways' sudden ownership change erupted across financial media with unprecedented velocity, but the story that emerged transcended typical corporate acquisition coverage. Within 6 hours of the mandatory SEC filing, investigative journalists had begun piecing together the connection between the hostile takeover and the discrimination incident that had triggered it, creating a narrative that captured public imagination like few business stories ever had. The revelation came first through Aviation Weekly reporter Thomas Mitchell, who had spent years covering airline industry labor disputes and had developed sources throughout Atlantic Sky's employee network. Mitchell received a tip from a flight crew member who had witnessed the champagne incident and recognized Dr. Washington's name when it appeared in connection with the acquisition. Financial journalist Amanda Chen of the Wall Street Business Network picked up Mitchell's initial reporting and expanded it into a comprehensive investigation that revealed the full scope of Marcus Washington's corporate empire. Her research into Apex Capital Management uncovered a track record of strategic investments that consistently generated extraordinary returns while maintaining an almost complete absence from public attention. Chen's breakthrough came when she identified the connection between HSG Investments and Apex Capital, revealing that the mysterious acquiring entity was actually a subsidiary controlled by one of the most successful private equity managers in American finance. Her exclusive interview with a former Apex Capital employee provided insights into Marcus Washington's methodical approach to identifying undervalued companies and transforming their operations through systematic management improvements. The story gained explosive momentum when social media platforms began amplifying the David versus Goliath narrative of a discrimination victim who turned out to be married to a financial titan capable of purchasing entire corporations. The hashtag #ChampagneJustice began trending within hours, accompanied by countless memes and commentaries celebrating what many saw as the ultimate example of consequences catching up with prejudiced behavior. Dr. Washington's background as a renowned cardiovascular surgeon added another layer of compelling detail to the narrative. Medical professionals across social media platforms shared stories of their own experiences with discrimination, creating a broader conversation about the systematic barriers faced by accomplished professionals of color, even in supposedly elite environments. The aviation industry's reaction was swift and dramatic. Competing airlines recognized immediately that Atlantic Sky's transformation would establish new standards for customer service and corporate accountability that they would be expected to match or exceed. Emergency board meetings were convened at United Continental, American Airlines, and Delta to review their own diversity policies and customer service protocols. Southwest Airlines CEO Patricia Johnson announced within 24 hours of the Atlantic Sky story breaking that her company would implement comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing employees despite having no recent discrimination incidents. The announcement was clearly reactive, designed to position Southwest as proactively addressing issues that Atlantic Sky had allowed to fester. International carriers also felt pressure to respond to what was being called the Washington Standard for airline customer service. British Airways issued a statement reaffirming their commitment to treating all passengers with dignity regardless of background, while Air France announced an independent review of their premium service protocols to ensure equitable treatment for all customers. The aviation industry found itself in the unprecedented position of responding to public pressure for increased oversight of airline employment practices.
FAA Administrator Robert Hayes announced that the agency would review its regulatory framework for airline customer service standards and consider implementing mandatory anti-discrimination training requirements for all aviation personnel. Labor unions representing flight attendants faced particular scrutiny as the story spread. The Association of Flight Attendants issued a statement condemning discriminatory behavior while defending the professionalism of their membership. But union leaders privately acknowledged that the Atlantic Sky incident had damaged their industry's reputation and could lead to increased regulatory oversight. Rebecca Walsh, who had returned to Chicago on an overnight flight completely unaware of the corporate upheaval her behavior had triggered, arrived at O'Hare International Airport to find her employment access codes had been deactivated and her supervisor waiting with termination paperwork. The speed of her dismissal reflected the new management's determination to demonstrate immediate accountability for discriminatory behavior. Walsh's termination was handled with clinical efficiency by Atlantic Sky's new Human Resources Director, Maria Santos, who had been recruited from a competing airline specifically to implement Dr. Washington's cultural transformation agenda. Santos delivered the news in a conference room at the airport, accompanied by legal counsel to ensure the dismissal complied with all employment law requirements. Your employment with Atlantic Sky Airways is terminated effective immediately for violation of company anti-discrimination policies and behavior detrimental to the airline's reputation and customer service standards, Santos informed Walsh, reading from a prepared statement that left no room for argument or appeal. Walsh's shock was complete and devastating. The comfortable career that had provided her with financial security and a sense of authority over passengers was eliminated in a matter of minutes, leaving her to contemplate the connection between her treatment of Dr. Washington and the sudden destruction of her professional life. The broader implications of Walsh's termination rippled throughout Atlantic Sky's workforce as employees realized that the new ownership would enforce standards of professional behavior with unprecedented strictness. Human resources departments at competing airlines reported increased inquiries from Atlantic Sky employees seeking alternative employment, suggesting that not everyone was prepared to adapt to the cultural changes being implemented. Dr. Washington's first week as interim CEO became a masterclass in strategic corporate communication. Rather than hiding from media attention, she embraced the opportunity to articulate a vision for airline customer service that resonated far beyond the aviation industry. Her interviews with major business publications demonstrated the same precision and clarity that characterized her surgical practice. In a particularly influential interview with Business Leadership magazine, Dr. Washington addressed the broader implications of corporate accountability for employee behavior. A company's culture is not an abstract concept, but a measurable reality that affects every customer interaction and every employee decision. When we tolerate discrimination, we send a message about our values that extends far beyond any single incident. Her medical background provided a unique perspective on organizational health that resonated with business leaders across industries. Just as a surgeon must address the root cause of a problem rather than simply treating symptoms, corporate leadership must examine the systemic factors that enable discriminatory behavior rather than simply punishing individual employees after problems occur. The transformation of Atlantic Sky Airways accelerated beyond what industry observers had thought possible. Dr. Washington implemented a comprehensive cultural assessment program that evaluated every aspect of the airline's operations, from crew training protocols to customer service standards to promotion and hiring practices. Independent consulting firm Meridian Cultural Dynamics was retained to conduct confidential interviews with over 2,000 Atlantic Sky employees, creating the most comprehensive analysis of airline workplace culture ever undertaken. The preliminary findings revealed patterns of discriminatory behavior and exclusionary practices that extended far beyond customer service into hiring, promotion, and workplace interaction norms.
The consulting team's recommendations led to immediate implementation of mandatory bias recognition training for all employees, restructured customer service protocols that emphasized consistent treatment regardless of passenger demographics, and new accountability measures that made discriminatory behavior grounds for immediate termination without the lengthy grievance processes that had previously protected problematic employees. Academic institutions began incorporating the Atlantic Sky transformation into business school curricula as a case study in rapid corporate culture change. Harvard Business School professor Elizabeth Morgan published a preliminary analysis arguing that the Washington approach represented a new model for addressing systematic discrimination through strategic ownership rather than regulatory enforcement. Morgan's analysis suggested that Marcus Washington's acquisition strategy could inspire similar approaches to corporate accountability in other industries where discrimination persisted despite legal protections and regulatory oversight. The combination of financial resources and moral authority demonstrated by the Washingtons offered a template that other investors might follow when confronting companies with poor diversity records. The financial markets responded to Atlantic Sky's transformation with surprising positivity. Despite initial uncertainty about the airline's direction under new ownership, customer satisfaction metrics improved dramatically within weeks of the management change. Social media sentiment analysis showed a remarkable shift in public perception of the Atlantic Sky brand, with many consumers expressing increased willingness to choose the airline specifically because of its commitment to equitable treatment. Stock analysts, who had initially viewed the acquisition skeptically, began revising their recommendations as operational improvements became evident. The airline's customer service ratings improved faster than industry experts had believed possible, suggesting that discriminatory practices had been significantly damaging to overall service quality, even beyond their direct impact on affected passengers. International business publications picked up the story, with the London Financial Times running a feature article on American corporate accountability that used Atlantic Sky as an example of how private sector solutions could address systematic discrimination more effectively than traditional regulatory approaches. The European Union's Aviation Regulatory Agency announced that they would review Atlantic Sky's transformation as a potential model for addressing discrimination complaints within European carriers, suggesting that the Washington approach might influence international aviation standards. As the sixth week of Dr. Washington's interim leadership concluded, Atlantic Sky Airways had become fundamentally different from the company that Marcus Washington had acquired. The change extended beyond policies and procedures to encompass a measurable shift in employee behavior and customer experience that validated his belief that corporate culture could be transformed through decisive leadership and accountability measures. The broader impact of the Atlantic Sky transformation continued to ripple throughout corporate America, establishing new expectations for how companies should respond to discrimination and creating a precedent that other investors and activists would study and potentially replicate across multiple industries. 18 months after Marcus Washington's acquisition of Atlantic Sky Airways, the airline industry had transformed beyond recognition. The Washington Standard, as business publications now called it, had become the benchmark against which corporate accountability and customer service excellence were measured across multiple industries. What had begun as a response to a single discriminatory incident had evolved into a fundamental reimagining of how American businesses approach diversity, inclusion, and corporate responsibility. Dr. Camille Washington stood at the podium of the National Business Ethics Conference in Denver, addressing an audience of over 3,000 corporate executives, academic researchers, and policymakers who had gathered to study the Atlantic Sky transformation. Her keynote address, titled Corporate Surgery: Removing Systemic Discrimination from American Business, represented the culmination of her unexpected journey from discrimination victim to transformational CEO. The transition from emergency medicine to corporate leadership had initially seemed impossible to Camille, but 18 months of experience had proven that the skills required for both professions were remarkably similar. Both demanded precise diagnosis of complex problems, swift decision-making under pressure, and the ability to implement systematic solutions that addressed root causes rather than symptoms.
Under her leadership, Atlantic Sky Airways had become the most customer satisfaction-rated airline in North America for 6 consecutive quarters. The transformation was measurable not just in surveys and reviews, but in concrete financial performance that validated Marcus's investment thesis. The airline's revenue per passenger had increased by 32%, employee retention rates had improved dramatically, and customer loyalty metrics exceeded industry benchmarks by unprecedented margins. The success of Atlantic Sky's cultural transformation had attracted attention from investors worldwide who sought to replicate the Washington approach in other industries plagued by discrimination and poor customer service. Marcus had established the Equity Capital Fund, a specialized investment vehicle that acquired companies with documented diversity problems and implemented systematic reforms designed to improve both corporate culture and financial performance. The fund's portfolio now included a luxury hotel chain that had faced multiple discrimination lawsuits, a high-end retail company with persistent workplace harassment issues, and a technology firm whose promotion practices had excluded women and minorities from leadership positions. Each acquisition followed the Atlantic Sky model: swift ownership transition, immediate leadership changes, comprehensive cultural assessment, and implementation of accountability measures that made discriminatory behavior financially devastating for perpetrators. Academic institutions had begun offering graduate-level courses in what professors termed justice-driven capitalism, examining how financial resources could be deployed to address systematic social problems through market mechanisms rather than regulatory enforcement. The Harvard Business School case study on Atlantic Sky Airways had become required reading in business ethics courses at over 200 universities worldwide. Dr. Elena Vasquez, professor of organizational behavior at Stanford University, had published the definitive academic analysis of the Atlantic Sky transformation in the Journal of Corporate Social Responsibility. Her research demonstrated that companies implementing the Washington Standard showed measurable improvements in employee satisfaction, customer loyalty, and financial performance within 12 to 18 months of cultural transformation initiatives. Her longitudinal study tracked 23 companies that had adopted Atlantic Sky's accountability model, finding that 16 showed significant improvements in diversity metrics, customer service ratings, and profitability. The research validated the business case for comprehensive anti-discrimination measures, while providing a replicable framework that other organizations could adapt to their specific contexts. The ripple effects of the Atlantic Sky story continued to influence corporate behavior across industries. Major consulting firms had developed specialized practices focused on cultural transformation services, offering the systematic diagnostic and implementation capabilities that the Washington approach required. McKinsey & Company established a dedicated inclusive excellence practice that had generated over $400 million in revenue, helping companies implement comprehensive diversity reforms. Technology companies in Silicon Valley faced particular pressure to address persistent discrimination in hiring and promotion practices. The Atlantic Sky president had demonstrated that companies with poor diversity records could become acquisition targets for activist investors willing to implement forced cultural transformation. Several major tech firms preemptively announced comprehensive diversity initiatives designed to avoid becoming the next high-profile example of justice-driven acquisition. The financial services industry experienced similar pressure, with several investment banks implementing extensive bias training and accountability measures after recognizing that their documented history of discrimination made them vulnerable to Washington-style acquisitions. Goldman Sachs announced a partnership with Apex Capital Management to develop industry best practices for addressing workplace discrimination through systematic cultural assessment and reform.
International businesses also felt the influence of the Washington Standard as American companies with global operations extended their reformed practices to international subsidiaries. The European Union cited Atlantic Sky's transformation as a model for corporate accountability when proposing new regulations requiring systematic anti-discrimination measures for companies operating within EU markets. 3 years after the original Champagne incident, Marcus and Camille Washington returned to Los Angeles for the dedication of the Washington Institute for Corporate Justice, a research center affiliated with UCLA that would study and promote business practices designed to eliminate systematic discrimination.
The institute represented their commitment to ensuring that the lessons learned from Atlantic Sky's transformation would continue influencing corporate behavior for generations. The dedication ceremony took place at the Beverly Hills Hotel, where Marcus had first planned the Atlantic Sky acquisition, creating a symbolic full circle that emphasized how far their mission had expanded beyond a single airline. The guest list included business leaders who had implemented the Washington Standard in their own companies, academic researchers studying justice-driven capitalism, and government officials exploring policy applications of their approach. During the ceremony, Marcus reflected on the unexpected trajectory that had transformed his family's personal experience into a movement for corporate accountability. "We never intended to become advocates for social justice through capitalism. We simply believed that discrimination should have consequences, and we had the resources to ensure those consequences were meaningful and lasting." The Institute's first major research project involved analyzing discrimination patterns across Fortune 500 companies to identify organizations most in need of cultural transformation. The research would be made publicly available, creating transparency about corporate diversity practices that would allow investors, customers, and employees to make informed decisions about their relationships with companies that tolerated discriminatory behavior. Dr. Washington announced her decision to return to medicine, though she would continue serving on Atlantic Sky's board of directors and as an advisor to the Equity Capital Fund. Her experience leading the airline's transformation had provided insights into organizational behavior that would inform her medical practice, particularly in addressing healthcare disparities that affected patient outcomes for minorities and underserved populations. Her replacement as CEO of Atlantic Sky Airways was Maria Santos, the human resources director who had overseen the airline's cultural transformation. Santos had been promoted through a comprehensive search process that demonstrated the effectiveness of the company's new merit-based advancement systems. Her appointment represented the institutionalization of the reforms that Dr. Washington had implemented, ensuring that Atlantic Sky's commitment to equitable treatment would persist beyond the founding leadership. The original flight crew from Flight 448 had experienced varying outcomes in the years following the incident. Captain Robert Hayes had been promoted to Atlantic Sky's chief pilot position, where he implemented new training protocols that emphasized the connection between crew behavior and passenger experience. His leadership reflected the airline's evolution from a company that tolerated discrimination to one that actively promoted inclusive excellence. Flight attendant Maria Gonzalez, who had witnessed Rebecca Walsh's discriminatory behavior, became a supervisor in Atlantic Sky's customer service training program. Her role involved sharing the lessons learned from the transformation with new employees, ensuring that the company's history of overcoming discrimination remained central to its corporate culture rather than a forgotten chapter. Rebecca Walsh's post-Atlantic Sky experience served as a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of discriminatory behavior in an increasingly connected world. Her termination had been widely publicized as part of the Atlantic Sky story, making it difficult to find employment in customer service positions within the airline industry. She eventually found work in a completely different field, though the experience had fundamentally changed her understanding of respect and professional responsibility. The broader aviation industry had been permanently altered by the Atlantic Sky transformation. Discrimination complaints against airlines decreased by 47% in the 3 years following the Washington acquisition, according to Department of Transportation statistics. The improvement reflected both better training and increased awareness among airline employees that discriminatory behavior could result in immediate termination and industry-wide reputation damage. Consumer advocacy groups credited the Atlantic Sky precedent with improving airline customer service across the industry. The threat of becoming a target for justice-driven acquisition had motivated airline executives to address cultural problems proactively, rather than waiting for incidents to force expensive reactive measures. The story's influence extended beyond corporate boardrooms into popular culture, inspiring documentaries, business books, and even a Hollywood film that dramatized the acquisition and transformation. The entertainment industry's attention helped maintain public awareness of corporate accountability issues while demonstrating that business success and social justice could be mutually reinforcing rather than conflicting objectives. As the Washington Institute for Corporate Justice began its operations, the legacy of a simple request for champagne had evolved into a permanent institution dedicated to eliminating systematic discrimination from American business. The Institute's research would influence policymakers, educate future business leaders, and provide resources for companies seeking to implement their own cultural transformations. Marcus Washington's final reflection on the Atlantic Sky experience emphasized the broader implications of their success. Individual acts of discrimination reflect systematic problems that require systematic solutions. We proved that corporate culture can be transformed when leadership has both the resources and the moral clarity to implement comprehensive change. Our hope is that other leaders will recognize their responsibility to create organizations where dignity and respect are not privileges to be earned, but rights to be guaranteed. The transformation of Atlantic Sky Airways from a company that tolerated discrimination into an industry leader in inclusive excellence demonstrated that justice and profitability could be achieved simultaneously. The Washington Standard had become more than a business strategy. It represented a new understanding of corporate responsibility that would influence American business practices for decades to come. The champagne that Rebecca Walsh had refused to serve Dr. Camille Washington had cost far more than anyone could have imagined. It had cost careers, corporate control, and comfortable assumptions about the consequences of discriminatory behavior. But it had also created something valuable, a template for systematic change that proved American businesses could eliminate discrimination through decisive leadership and comprehensive cultural transformation. The legacy of Flight 448 would endure not in the memory of a single injustice, but in the institutions, practices, and standards that emerged from the response to that injustice. The Washington Standard ensured that future generations of business leaders would understand that discrimination was not just morally wrong, but financially catastrophic, creating powerful incentives for companies to build cultures of respect and inclusion that served all stakeholders effectively. 3 years after a flight attendant looked at a black woman and decided she was unworthy of champagne, American corporate culture had been fundamentally transformed. The true cost of that glass of champagne was measured not in dollars, but in the systematic changes that ensured no other passenger would face similar discrimination. The price of prejudice had been calculated with unprecedented precision, and the bill had been paid in full.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.